I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I encourage you to take your Bible and open it up to Exodus chapter 3, if you would. We'll be there for our text for most of the lesson tonight. While you're turning there, I want to talk about my perspective on being here tonight. And there's a reason I'm going to do this. It's because my perspective has affected some of the things that I intend to say, and even to an extent, how I'm going to say them. David's mentioned already that I've been at Stewart now for almost 22 years. In that time, I have preached 1,746 sermons in Stewart. 1,746. I have very good records on my computer. Also in that time, I have taught more than 2,000 classes, Bible classes. So that means almost 4,000 times I've had the opportunity to teach the Bible or preach a sermon just for the congregation at Stewart. That means I've had the chance to push people a little bit and encourage them, and that's a lot. You know, if you have a tired week or a bad week, you still get another opportunity to try to help somebody, right? But on the other hand, as I was thinking about tonight and talking about our topic, which is going to be on leadership, I realized that this is the only time. There's not 4,000 opportunities for me to talk to you about leadership. There's one. And so my perspective in preparing this lesson and presenting this lesson is that for one opportunity, I need to do the very best that I can do in presenting God's Word in such a way that when you and I leave here tonight, we've grown closer to God. But that takes more than me. Clearly it takes God, but it also takes you. And so I hope that as we approach this topic of leadership tonight, we approach it from an open mind and a challenge. Because this is a challenge. It's too easy. You're going to see in a little while. It's too easy to talk about somebody else. I'm not preaching to somebody else tonight. I'm talking to you. And I studied it for me. So let's start this way. Have you ever had the experience of you had to go to the doctor, you went to the doctor's office, and as you got inside, all the chairs were taken in the waiting room, and so you checked in, and then you had to stand there. And then after a little while, somebody came out of the doctor's office, and 2 or 3 people got up out of the seats, and they left with them, and they had really no contextual purpose for being there. And what I mean by that is they weren't there to see the doctor. They just came with somebody else, so they were just taking up seats, right? Or maybe you went to a restaurant and when you got there, they said they were full, but you could wait. You kind of had to wait for 15 minutes or so. And so you're sitting there waiting and you're looking there and you see there are tables where they're not eating. They're just sitting around talking. And you think, well, I sure am hungry. I wish they weren't taking up all that space. Well, I'm not really concerned about your doctor's visits or your restaurant visits, but I do use that to illustrate this. I believe that it is a fact that there are people in the church who are taking up space. They're just existing. And in fact, I think there are people who gather for our classes or for worship services who aren't even there to worship. They're there because somebody's going to get angry with them if they don't go, or somebody's going to call them and complain at them. A spouse is going to gripe. Or maybe they're there because, they want to see their friends that are also in the church club with them. Rather than being there for the purpose of worshiping God and growing into something more than they were yesterday, they're just existing. They're just taking up space. Well, the text in Exodus chapter 3 comes at a time in which I believe that that's who Moses was. I believe that he is taking up space. He's just been existing. And so God shows up to him and he calls his name twice. And I know that you've had several speakers already, so I know that people have talked about that, what the implication is of the name being told twice. But I want to do it again just in case they didn't. I don't hear God in my mind saying, Moses, Moses, I want you to do this. I hear him saying, Moses, Moses. Some kind of attention getting. I'll illustrate this. A couple days ago, we were at the house, and my wife, who came with me tonight, by the way, was sitting out on our back porch in one of our chairs out there. I don't know what they call them. And she's talking on the phone. And so I thought, I think I'll go outside with her. And so I started to go outside, and I saw, and on the ground, I thought one of the girls, one of our granddaughters, had left one of their toys on the floor behind my wife's chair. And I didn't think any more of it. I opened the sliding door, I stepped out, and that toy moved. I thought it was a toy snake. It was not. And so I said, Terry, there's a snake behind you. Because I didn't want her to get into that, right? I wanted her attention. I see that with Moses now. He says, God doesn't say, Moses, Moses, do this. He says, Moses, Moses, I need you to listen to me right now. And then he talks about leadership. And so that's what we're dealing with tonight. We're dealing with a call to leadership, because here's what I believe. I believe that God has called every single one of us to lead. Now, I'm not necessarily obviously talking about church leadership, because we have specific roles that are designated for men. I understand that, but that doesn't give everyone an excuse to back up and say, well, that's those guys that lead and I don't have a job. Listen, we've got a job. God expects us to lead in our homes. He expects us to lead in our schools. He expects us to lead in our workplace. He does expect us to lead in the church. And by the way, if you can get an excuse out of all of those, at the very least, if you're a Christian, God expects you to lead others to Him, doesn't He? So it's about leadership, and this has application to every single person who is seeking to follow God. And so I'm going to read through the text with you a little at a time, and what I'm going to do is, it's interesting that the devotional was about a mirror. I want to talk about Moses, what he sees, and part of that time he's looking in a mirror. But that's not where we start. Where we're going to start is, the first thing he saw was a bush. And so let's read that, and then I'll talk about that a little bit. Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. Now, you know who Moses is. I'm not telling you anything about him that you don't already know, but I do want to talk about some things to really set this perspective. You know that at one point in time, Moses was a part of the royal family, right? And he got that way because God providentially was preparing him to do something. So Moses comes into this world at a terrible time for the Hebrew people. They're enslaved in Egypt, and it's getting worse and worse, and the Pharaoh has set forth this edict that all of these children, the male children, have to be killed, and it's God's providence that protects Moses. You know the account. He ends up in the basket in the water. He's drawn out by Pharaoh's daughter. That's God's providence. But even further, God made it possible for his own mother, for Moses' own mother, to be the one that would train him, that would nourish him. And somewhere in all of that nourishment, we don't know when, we don't know how, but what we do know is somewhere during that time in which she was teaching him and nourishing him in life, she told him about the history of his people, which included the promises that God had made. And so at some point, that becomes so weighty on Moses that he decides, at 40 years old, he decides he's going to go out and visit his people. Because he has in his mind, Stephen will tell us later in Acts chapter 8, the sermon that cost Stephen his life, he would look back on that account and he would say what Moses was thinking would be that these Israelites, these Hebrews, would know that he's supposed to be leading them to freedom. So he goes out to visit his people, and in the course of doing so, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he kills that man. He believes the people will know that he is the one to lead them out of this captivity into their freedom, but they don't know. So now he's alone. He doesn't have the Hebrews. They don't understand him. They don't even consider him as one of them. And since he's killed the Egyptian, he does not have his place in the royal family. He's alone. And so what he chooses to do is he runs. At some point, we don't know when, at some point in the wilderness, he meets and marries a young woman. Her father's name is Jethro. He ultimately becomes a shepherd for Jethro. 40 years. 40 years. He gets up every day, and it's pretty much the same day. He has no reason at this point in his life to think that tomorrow's going to be any different than yesterday or next year's going to be any different than last year, because it's been 40 years since he experienced the blessings of royalty or the privileges of royalty. Oh yeah, what might have been, how many times in that 40 years do you think he thought, what went wrong? My mother told me about this. She told me about God's promises. She told me about what God wanted me to be, how God wanted me to lead, but I did it and it didn't work. And then he sees a bush. And it's not just a bush that's on fire. I mean, surely he's seen that before. You couldn't be 40 years in the wilderness with the sheep and never have seen a fire, right? But this one was not being consumed. That's what's different. That's what causes him to say, I don't know what's going on, but something's different about this. And so the text says he turned aside. I love that wording, because he could have very easily seen a fire and thought, that's danger to my sheep. I'm going to go this way. But he didn't. He turned aside to that bush. 80 years old. What's God doing with all of this? Have you noticed that I'm a sports fan? I am. Have you noticed that there's a difference in the way that professional sports teams develop their players? Like the National Football League, if you're a Dolphins fan. They have the NFL draft. The Dolphins draft a hotshot kid out of college. They sign him to a multi-million-dollar contract. They put him in front of the media, and then they expect him to contribute his value today, right? Or at very least during the first season, right? On the other hand, if you're a Major League Baseball fan, a Major League Baseball team very frequently will draft a kid out of high school or even young college, and they'll sign him to a multi-million-dollar contract, and then they'll send him to Jupiter or West Palm Beach or St. Lucie, and they'll play for single-A short league season. Why? Well, it's because if you take that kid who's not ready yet and you put him on an opening day roster in front of 50,000 fans and a televised audience against Nolan Ryan, and that dates me, I know that, but still, I don't know that many pitchers anymore, he's going to fail. And so they send him somewhere where he can learn to do what he needs to do so that when he gets where he needs to be, he's capable of doing the job. I believe that what we're being told about Moses finally seeing this bush at 80 years old is that God works on that timetable. God works more like the Major League Baseball teams than NFL teams. Moses, at 40 years old, thought he was ready to lead. But the people didn't think that. And so 40 years later, after God's had him out in the wilderness with these sheep, all of a sudden now God says, I think you're ready. But that takes us to the second point that I want to make. Moses didn't just see a bush. Moses saw God. Let's read again further. Exodus 3, verses 4 and 5. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Now, do you see why I said I put that emphasis there? I don't see him saying, Moses, Moses, just stop right there. No, he says, Moses, Moses, don't come any closer. In fact, take your shoes off. Isn't that interesting? I wonder how many times Moses had shepherded in this same area. I mean, he's got to have been pretty close that morning because he saw the bush, right? It's not like you're going to see that from a great distance. And I wonder how many times do you think he shepherded that flock on this very same ground with his shoes on? I don't know what it's true, but I think the odds that he was wearing his shoes were pretty close to 100%, don't you? And now all of a sudden he's got to take his shoes off? What in the world is the point of that? Well, I think it's so that he would see God. I think he's being taught a lesson here. What he's being taught is even dirt has some value when it's associated with God. Moses is going to, in just a minute, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but he's going to consider himself pretty much dirt. And God's going to say, well, when you're associated with me, I can even use dirt. I don't think any of you have ever seen inside my office at the church building at Stewart, but if you had, you would see a mess. I know everything that's in there. I know where it is, but it's a mess. And I have a cabinet in my office that I open about once a year. I haven't opened it in a long time, so maybe it's time for me to open it again. But I know as soon as I pull that out, right over in the corner, there are 2 baseballs. And if you were to open that cabinet and pull those baseballs out and look at them, you would say, these are junk. Might as well just throw these away. And yet I've kept them for 24 years. You want to know why? Because 24 years ago, I coached a 9 and 10-year-old Little League baseball team in Jupiter, and they won the championship that year, and those boys signed those baseballs and gave them to me, and they matter to me because those boys mattered to me. They're 35 years old now, and I've got baseballs they signed when they were 10. That's what God was saying about this dirt, and consequently what he was also saying about Moses. He said, Moses, it's not about you, it's about me. When you associate with me, you connect with holiness. What that means is when I come into God's presence, that changes me. When I allow God to use me, that changes me. I don't look at myself, which we'll get to in just a minute, and see my limitations. I look at a God and see his power. I'm not the 10 spies that went into land and came back and said, I looked at myself in the mirror and that guy's bigger than me. No, I learned to be the 2 spies who came back and said, I looked at my God and saw that he's bigger than them. God can even use the dirt. The implication of that is he can use me. Can he use me for everything? No, probably not. I mean, we like to think about the fact that we live in a land of freedom, that anybody has any opportunity, but it's not really true. I grew up with a lot of goals that I could have never achieved no matter what. Can you see me playing in the NBA? I lack 2 things, height and talent. If I'd had those 2 things, I probably could have played in the NBA. So not every door is open to everybody, but God opens the doors that you have the talent and the ability and the willingness to walk through. And that has to do with leadership. So Moses has seen a bush, and he's also seen a God. So now he looks in a mirror. After you see God, this is what happens. He looks in a mirror and he sees himself. Let's start in verse 6 of Exodus chapter 3. What time did you say I've got to quit? 10 after? Okay. Exodus 3, beginning of verse 6, going down through verse 10. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, again, I want to go back to this idea that undoubtedly this day started like every day in Moses' life for pretty much 40 years. Undoubtedly, he had expected nothing to be any different. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there is also no doubt that at least a good portion of those 40 years he would have been thinking back to what had happened in Egypt and thinking back to his people who, by the way, are still there. Still there. And wondered why. Why aren't you doing something, God? What's taking so long? Isn't that what we do? We ask God, we pray to God, and then when it doesn't happen the way we want it to happen, and when we want it to happen, we say, well, why not? Why aren't you doing this my way? And so now this conversation shifts, and initially it's not toward Moses, but I can picture it. I can picture it. If it's me especially, I can picture it. He's standing there, and God's told him to take off his shoes, and so he's got no shoes on. He is humbled before God, and God says, listen, I know what's happening back there in Egypt. I know about it. I've heard their cries, and it's time. It's time that I go back and get them. And not only am I going to go back and get them, but I'm going to take them to this place that I promised. You know, this land that's flowing with milk and honey, the land that I promised so long ago to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And I can picture Moses as he's getting excited. He's 80 years old now. All of his life he has been taught about God and God's people and this promise that was made. He knows about the bones of Joseph. And God says, I'm going to do it now. I can't imagine how exciting that would be for Moses. And then God says, now you go do it. And I think everything changed. Wait a second. Me? No. 40 years ago, yeah, I was ready. I'm 80 years old now. I know the excuses he makes. I know what happens at this point. He says, paraphrasing, I'm a nobody. I mean, who am I? I'm a nobody. How many times have you said that? When somebody gets up and they're going to make an announcement, they say, you know, we need a Bible class teacher for this age, or we need somebody to be involved with this, and we sit in the pew and we say, well, I sure hope somebody does that. Those kids need good teachers. I hope somebody will do it. Who will be volunteer to be a part of this work, or who's going to talk to your neighbor about the gospel? I hope somebody will do it. You know, I get calls sometimes, or people will come up to me and they'll say things like, listen, I would really like for you to go study with my brother. Okay. Have they asked for a study? Well, no. Okay. Have you talked to them about a study? No. Do they know me? No. Do they know you've asked me to come talk to them? No. Has anybody done anything? Well, I thought that's what you were going to do. Well, then I knock on the door or something, or call them or email them or something, and they delete it or don't answer the door, just like they do with everybody else that knocks on their door. Because we were waiting for somebody to go do it. Moses says, I'm a nobody. And God says, you're not a nobody. I made you. I prepared you for this job. 80 years you've been training. It's time to go do it. Moses says, he's pleading discomfort, by the way. I'm not comfortable doing this. Then he says, I'm not smart enough. I can't answer. What if they ask a question that I can't answer? You've never said that, have you? I've said it. I feel it every time I study with somebody now. What if they ask a question that I can't answer? God, I don't even know what to tell them if they ask me who you are. And God says, I'll tell you who I am. And Moses says, they're not even going to believe me. And God says, well, they'll believe you. I'll give you some miracles to show that I'm the one working through you. God, I'm not really much of a speaker. Maybe he gets nervous, maybe he stutters, I don't know. He just said, I'm not much of a speaker. And God said, well, I'll tell you what, I made your mouth, and so I know what you can and can't do. And if you're worried about it, I'm going to send Aaron to go with you to speak for you. And by the way, he's on his way out here already. And then look at verse 13. This is the worst part of the account. He says, oh, my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send. I just don't want to do it. And I'll tell you something, in the account, that's when God got angry. That's when God's patience ended and he got angry. And I have to wonder, how is that different than us? When there's a challenge of somewhere to lead, and I know it's hard, but when there's a challenge to lead at home or at work or in the school or in the neighborhood or in the church in some way, and I sit back and I say, I hope somebody else does that, and then somebody comes to me and say, hey, why don't you do this? Nah, I'm a nobody. I don't know enough. I don't think anybody's going to listen to me, and I'm not really very good at it. And then they answer all the excuses, and I say, I was just making up excuses. I just really don't want to do it. And I wonder how many of us that describes. You know what, though? Here's the thing. He did finally listen, didn't he? And he did go back to Egypt. And you know what? They did believe him. Not at first, but he had those miracles, didn't he? And the Hebrews started paying attention first. But eventually, everybody paid attention. And you know what? Just like God said, God did it through Moses, but Moses led, just like God asked him to do, and he led them out of captivity, didn't he? And that put them in a position where they were ready when they get to the sea, and here comes the Egyptian army behind them, and God says, I saw this picture back there in your hall just a little while ago on the wall. God said, stand still. Or Moses said, stand still and see the salvation of God, and the water parted. I got to tell you something. We tell that as a kid's story, and so it kind of sanitizes it for me, but I don't know about you, but if we had miraculous things like that happening, and we went down to the beach tonight, and David stood there with a stick and said, what's this? And held out a stick, and the water parted from here to Nassau, who's walking first? But they did it because they believed God, because Moses led them to God. That is the significance of a leader. You're going somewhere. You know where you're going. You know how to get there. And you know how to take others with you. Is that not important? And it's not just the big public role that you may see. Somebody led you to Christ. I don't know whether it was a preacher somewhere or a parent or a friend or a spouse, but somebody did it, didn't they? And if we are faithful to God and the leaders He calls us to be, somebody will be led to God because of us. Okay. So now I want to be very practical. Leadership, the reason Moses made excuses and the reason we do, and the reason eventually we say, I just don't want to do it as Moses did, is because it's hard. It's hard. It's hard to be a leader in the Lord's church. I chose this topic when David gave me the options because I've been thinking about leadership lately. I don't know the situation with the eldership here at Palm Beach Lakes. I know the men, but I don't know everything about, I don't know all the things I'm going to say, so I'm going to use Stewart. There are 3 men currently serving the church as elders at the church in Stewart. One of them has been serving for more than 20 years. One of them has been serving over 17 years, and the other one has been serving 16 years. That's me. I've got the worst health of any of them, and I'm the youngest. So here's what I'm thinking. I don't think we're going to be around another 30 years. I don't really think we're going to be around another 20. It might be possible even that we won't be around another 1. Who's going to lead then? Do you just, if something happened to your eldership, what do you have, 6, 5, 6? 5 elders? If something tragic happened as the course of this year goes on and you lose 3 of your elders and you start saying, we need to do something here, do you just say, let's take a vote? Do you just say, I'll tell you what, we're down to our last option, so we choose you? Is that the way it works? You know, there are qualifications that Paul presents by inspiration to us, and we always go and look at that, but I would challenge you to read them again and look at them. I don't think those are all no-go things. You know, I know some of them are. Faithful, okay, that's a go, no-go. But patience, I mean, is there like you get to this point and you're go, but if you slip down, you're no-go? I think those are there more than just qualifications. I think those are about survival. You cannot survive in leadership until God has prepared you to be there, until you've let Him prepare you to be there. And what I'm saying all of that about is because in 20 years, there's a door that God may open for you, but you will not step through that door until you let Him use you today. 5 years, God may open a door for you that you can't even dream about now. You won't step through that door in 5 years unless you let Him use you today. I read a statement that was attributed to Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart is the football coach for the Georgia Bulldogs. Kirby Smart was talking about leadership and the challenges of leadership. He said there are 3 high costs of leadership. Let me give those to you. He said that when you're leading, you will have to make hard decisions that negatively affect people that you care about. But if it's the right thing to do and you're the leader, you do it anyway. He said that when you're leading, you will be disliked despite your best attempt to do the best for the most people. But if it's the right thing to do and you're the leader, you do it. And he said that when you're leading, you will be misunderstood and you won't always have the opportunity to defend yourself. But when it's the right thing to do and you're the leader, you do it. Is that not the account of Moses? Did he struggle with it? Yes. Did he give all the excuses? Yes. But finally, he paid attention to God. He looked at himself and said, it's the right thing to do. God wants me to lead, and I'm going to do it. Now, what about us? If you came here tonight to be entertained, if you came here tonight because of me, if you came here tonight because somebody was going to gripe at you if you didn't come here, if you came here tonight for any reason other than to grow closer to God, then you have missed the day that God gave you to get prepared for the door He's going to open in 10 years. God calls all of us to lead. I just have to be willing to be humble enough to look at what's happening in my life, to look at the opportunities that are there, and let God use me where He'll use me today. So that someday, maybe, He'll even be able to use me in greater regard to His glory. Because here's the bottom line. It's not about you and me at all. It's always about God. And so if God is here and we are associated with Him, then we are made holy. It's about God. So I challenge all of us. This is the last thing I'm going to say. This is why I introduced the lesson the way I did way back a while ago with the purpose of my approach to this lesson. The last thing I'm going to say is, tomorrow, when you have the opportunity to lead and you make the excuse that you just, whatever excuse you make and you don't do it, go back and read Moses again. How would the account have read different if he hadn't have stepped up that day? What would have happened with Israel? And you say, well, God would have done it another way. Yeah, He probably would have, but how? And who would have been lost because of it? You have to make the decision to lead, because God will use you if that's what you'll do. Okay, let's close with a prayer. And I'm getting out just a few minutes early. Let's close with a prayer.